Hello, and thank you for joining us for the 50th episode of Into the Killing. We can't believe we got here, and we couldn't have done it without your support. If you've been listening for a while, we can't thank you enough because we wouldn't have been able to get here without you. For today's episode, we will travel back to December 1984. On December 3rd, 1984, there was a methyl isocyanate leak from a Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal, India. Over 8,000 people were killed that day, and over 500,000 were injured. The death toll eventually rose to over 23,000 people. It was the worst industrial accident in history. On December 10th, 1984, South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu was presented with the Nobel Peace Prize. On December 19th, 1984, Chinese Premier Xiao Xingzong and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration. The treaty declared that Hong Kong would be transferred back to China in 1997. For all of December 1984, the number one movie was the action comedy Beverly Hills Cop, starring Eddie Murphy. It went on to be the highest grossing movie of 1984. It is also considered the film that made Eddie Murphy an international movie star. On December 21st, 1984, the number one song was Like a Virgin by Madonna. Like a Virgin was Madonna's lead single from the album of the same name. It was Madonna's second album, and Like a Virgin was her first single to hit number one. It would stay at the number one spot for 6 weeks. In December 1984, 20-year-old Terry Sims was a student at Midwestern State University, and she also worked part-time as an EKG specialist at Bethania Hospital. Both the hospital and the university are in Wichita Falls, Texas. Wichita Falls is a small city in northern Texas, about 15 miles south of the Oklahoma border. It is home to the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame. It has a unique building billed as the world's tallest skyscraper. The story behind the building goes that in the early 20th century, Wichita Falls was experiencing an economic surge because of a petroleum boom. In 1919, a man who owned an oil company named J.D. McMahon offered to build a skyscraper for the city. He collected $200,000 from investors, which is about $3.2 million in 2022. McMahon owned his own construction company and set to work constructing the building. The investors were shocked when the building was finished because it was only 4 stories tall. They ended up suing McMahon, but he had a defense. In the contract, he pointed out that the skyscraper only had to be 480 inches tall instead of 480 feet tall. 2 apostrophes denote an inch, and a foot is 1 apostrophe. When the investors read the contract, they didn't notice that there were 2 apostrophes after 480 and not 1. As a result, they had no legal recourse. Over 100 years later, the Newby McMahon building, which is its official name, is still standing. It is a Texas historical landmark and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. But anyway, back to December 1981. On December 20th, 20-year-old Terry Sims finished her shift at the hospital at about 11 p.m. Her friend, Lisa Boone, finished her shift at the same time. After working, they went to a mutual friend's home for a Christmas party. Sims and Boone left at about 12:30 a.m. and they went back to Boone's home. Sims was going to sleep over, and in the morning, Boone was going to help her study for her final exam. Terry Sims had an unusual upbringing. Her father was killed in a high-speed chase with the police when she was 13 months old. Her mother went from man to man, never staying with anyone too long. Her mother had 2 more children. She left all 3 children with her grandparents to raise. However, a lot of responsibility fell to Sims. For example, when her younger sister went to tennis tryouts and she was the only one with a second-hand racket, she was upset. So Sims purchased a new racket for her. Shortly after Sims and Boone got home, Boone was called back to the hospital to do another shift. so she left Sims in her home alone. Boone did not take her keys with her. The next morning, Boone returned home and knocked on the door, which was locked. But Sims didn't answer it. Boone got a copy of the keys from her landlord. She then let herself in. She was immediately shocked by the condition of her apartment. The living room had been trashed. Boone knew something horrible had happened, so she got out of the home and went to her landlord's home. The landlord went into Boone's bathroom, and in a pool of dried blood, he found the nude, dead body of 20-year-old Terry Sims. She had been bound and sexually assaulted. She had been stabbed a total of 12 times, 8 times in the chest, 3 times on the right side of the back, and once in the left upper arm. It was a brutal murder, and the police put a lot of effort into finding the killer. But the problem was they couldn't find anyone who had wanted to hurt Sims. Also, she was killed while staying at the apartment of Lena Boone. Was the killer actually targeting Boone? If that was the case, why did he brutally murder Sims instead? Sure, he may have killed her to keep her quiet, but tying her up, raping her, and stabbing her a dozen times seems like a lot of rage was involved in the murder. So is the killer really stalking Sims? Or was he just content to kill any woman he could? The police had no answers to these questions, and unfortunately, the case went cold. Toni Gibbs was born and raised in Clayton, New Mexico. In high school, she was a cheerleader and the homecoming queen. After high school, she attended Midwestern State University to get a degree in art. She had 2 brothers who lived in Wichita Falls, and she fell in love with the area when she visited it. 2 years into her schooling, she decided she wanted to be a nurse. She graduated from the school's nursing program in 1984 and got a job as a registered nurse at Wichita General Hospital. At the end of 1984, 23-year-old Toni Gibbs told her family that someone had been harassing her on the phone late at night. The calls were obscene, and the male caller would describe his sexual fantasies. Other times he would call and just breathe heavily into the phone. It turned out that Gibbs was not the only female hospital employee to receive these calls. Many women who worked at the 2 hospitals in the city had made reports to the police regarding disturbing phone calls. At the hospital where Terry Sims worked, 24 women reported being harassed. On January 19, 1985, Gibbs did not show up for work. Gibbs was usually very punctual, and her supervisor became concerned when she didn't answer her phone. The supervisor called the police and Gibbs' 2 brothers. A police officer and the brothers found the door to Gibbs' apartment locked and her car was not in the parking lot. The brothers filed a missing persons report. Gibbs' family eventually was able to get into her apartment. Nothing was stolen or out of place. 4 days later, Gibbs' car was found abandoned a few miles from her home. Inside the car was her purse, which contained her driver's license. The car was locked and the keys were missing. Several weeks went by and no trace of Gibbs was found. We're just going to take a short break to bring you a message from our great sponsor, Acorn TV. Maybe it's the old roads and buildings, but I always think that Britain is a great setting for gritty crime stories. After all, it is home to one of the most infamous serial killers in history, Jack the Ripper. So I love Acorn TV because they have plenty of British crime stories that are incredibly well written and beautifully acted. Acorn TV is the largest commercial-free British streaming service. Their series, miniseries, and movies have some of the best stories out there. Besides having full series with great stories, they also have exclusive premieres and originals you can't find anywhere else. In their library, they have hundreds of exclusive, award-winning shows from around the world in nearly every genre imaginable. One series I really liked is a dramedy called Under the Vines. It stars Rebecca Gidney and Charles Edward, who play 2 city slickers who inherit a failing vineyard in rural New Zealand. Both are far from capable from running a vineyard, and they despise each other. But they somehow have to work together to make the vineyard successful, even if it's just to sell it. In these type of series, it's all about the casting, and in this case, it's pitch perfect. Under the Vines is so much fun to watch just to see the two main leads interact. Of course, Acorn TV has plenty of other series that are cleverly written, visually striking, and feature renowned actors and hosts like David Tennant and Mary Berry. A miniseries I really enjoyed, and I think you'll like too, is called Code of a Killer. It is about Alex Jeffries and the discovery of genetic fingerprinting, which led to the first person to be arrested thanks to DNA profiling. It is a riveting 3-part series you won't easily forget. You get thousands of hours of new, enthralling content on Acorn TV, and at $5.99 a month is just a fraction of the cost of other streaming services. Try Acorn TV free for 30 days by going to acorn.tv and using my promo code listed. But you have to make sure you enter the code in all lowercase letters. That's acorn.tv, promo code listed, to get your first 30 days free. Acorn.tv, code listed. On February 15th, the day after what would have been her 24th birthday, a repairman with an electrical company found the body of Toni Gibbs. Her body was in a field outside of Wichita Falls. Wichita Falls is in Wichita County, and Gibbs's nude body was found in Archer County. So the Archer County Sheriff's Department took over the investigation. The medical examiner counted 8 stab wounds, 3 on the chest, 3 on the back, and 2 on the left forearm and thumb, which were most likely defensive wounds. The police found an old abandoned trolley car close to the body. They got inside of it and discovered it was covered in blood. They concluded that Gibbs was kidnapped as she was walking to her car. In Gibbs's car, the killer either drove out to the field or forced Gibbs to drive. He raped her and stabbed her in the trolley car and left her to die. After he left, she crawled out looking for help, but tragically found no one around. A few weeks later, the police had a suspect in Toni's murder, 24-year-old Danny Laughlin. Laughlin worked as a male stripper. He had become obsessed with the case when Gibbs went missing. He had told many people that they had met at a nightclub before she went missing, and they had been friends. Then, after the body was found, he said he had been riding his dirt bike in the same field days earlier. He had even climbed on top of the trolley car. He said he was amazed he had not found the body. The police had Laughlin take a polygraph exam, and he denied being involved in the murder. The expert determined that he was not being truthful. Semen found at the crime scene was compared to Laughlin's semen and was inconclusive. But Laughlin continued to be the prime suspect in the murder. At the time, the police said there was no connection between Terry Sims' murder and Toni Gibbs' murder. Yes, there were similarities, like they were both young employees at a hospital and both were raped and stabbed to death, but that's where the similarities ended. Sims was killed in her friend's home, while Gibbs apparently was stalked in the weeks before her murder. Then she was kidnapped, taken to a remote area outside the county where she was killed, and then her body was left there. Also, 2 different law enforcement agencies were investigating each murder. The Wichita Falls Police Department was in charge of Sims's murder case, and the Archer County Sheriff's Department was leading the investigation into Gibbs's murder. Ellen Blau grew up in an affluent family in New Haven County, Connecticut. Her father owned an ink company that supplied U.S. currency with ink. Blau attended private school, but she had a rebellious streak. When she was in her junior year, she started dating a man who was 6 years older than her. Blau's parents did not approve of the relationship, so Blau and the man ran away together. They moved to Wichita Falls, where the man's brother lived. Blau's parents came to Wichita Falls and brought her home. But when she graduated from high school, she moved back to Wichita Falls. It wasn't long before the relationship with her boyfriend soured, and she moved out of the trailer home that they rented. She eventually got a job as a waitress, and then she enrolled part-time at Midwestern State University. On September 20th, 1985, 21-year-old Ellen Blau didn't show up for work. It turned out that she didn't make it home after her shift the night before. One of her friends happened to see her car parked in the parking lot of a convenience store that was a few blocks from her work. He checked out the car and saw that the keys were in the ignition, and he thought that her purse was on the front seat. So the police were called. On October 10th, about a month after Ellen Blau went missing, a worker with Wichita County was mowing some grass outside the city. He was about 4 miles from where her car had been abandoned. He found the new dead body of a young woman. She was identified as 21-year-old Ellen Blau. Since she was found in Wichita County, the Wichita County Sheriff's Department took over the investigation. The medical examiner had a hard time determining how she was killed because of the state of the remains, but there were no obvious gunshot or stab wounds, so she thought that Blau had possibly been strangled to death. It was impossible to determine if she had been raped. At the time, the authorities did not think that Blau's murder was connected to the murders of Terry Sims and Toni Gibbs. Blau was not a hospital worker, and she had not been stabbed to death. A major problem was that each murder was being investigated by a different law enforcement agency, and they did not share information. So while there may have been evidence that proved all 3 murders were connected, no one would have known because no one examined the evidence from all 3 cases. The Sheriff's Department had no promising suspects in the murder of Ellen Blau, and soon her case went cold. Three days before Blau's body was found, Danny Laughlin was charged with the murder of Toni Gibbs. He went to trial in April 1986. The case was entirely circumstantial, and there was no physical evidence connecting him to the murder. The trial lasted about 2 weeks. Then the jury deliberated for 14.5 hours over 2 days. But the jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision, so a mistrial was declared. It turned out that 11 of the jurors had voted to acquit. Since Laughlin was almost acquitted, the district attorney decided not to try him again. After that, the murders of the 3 women went cold. In 1996, the investigators got a sample of Danny Laughlin's DNA. They compared it to the semen found in Toni Gibbs' murder. It was not a match, so the cases were considered cold again. They stayed that way until 1999, 14 years after the 3 women were murdered. 1999 was a massive year for female singers. 8 of the top 10 Billboard songs were either sung by solo women artists or women-fronted bands. The top 3 songs were Believe by Cher, No Scrubs by TLC, and Angel of Mine by Monica. As for movies, Star Wars Episode 1 was the biggest box office draw, followed by The Sixth Sense and Toy Story 2. That year, an investigator named John Little with the Wichita County District Attorney's Office was assigned to investigate the cases. John Little considered it personally important to solve the murders. He and his wife had known Toni Gibbs. When she was missing, Little and his brother helped search for her. Little was curious about whether there was any way to connect the 3 cases. It turned out, in evidence, they had semen samples from the murders of Sims and Gibbs. They were compared, and it turned out to be from the same man. But the DNA did not match any DNA profiles in their databases. Lil then began to read through all the case files. Close to the bottom of Blau's file, he found a single-page report about a confessed killer named Faryion Wardrip. In October 1986, about a year after Ellen Blau's murder, Wardrip was being transported by 2 officers from Galveston, Texas to Wichita Falls. Along the way, Wardrip said that he knew a woman named Ellen Blau. Little thought that Wardrip was worth investigating. Tina Kimbrough was a 21-year-old waitress who lived alone in an apartment in Wichita Falls. On March 6, 1986, Kimbrough had plans with her cousin. Her cousin went to her apartment, but no one answered the door. Their grandmother came over with the key to the apartment and let them in. They found Kimbrough dead on the couch. The medical examiner determined she had been suffocated to death with a pillow. 3 days later, on May 9th, 27-year-old Faryion Wardrip called the police in Galveston, threatening suicide. Galveston is in southern Texas, about 426 miles away from Wichita Falls. Once the police picked him up, he confessed to murdering Tina Kimbrough. He said that Kimbrough reminded him of his ex-wife, which made him angry. Lil was wondering who exactly was Faryion Wardrip. Wardrip was born in Salem, Indiana in March 1959. Not much is known about his childhood or his adolescence. When he was 19, he joined the Army National Guard. In 1983, he married a woman in Wichita Falls. The marriage was troubled because Wardrip was addicted to drugs and alcohol. The same year he got married, he got a job at Wichita Falls General Hospital as a janitor. Within a year, he was promoted to orderly. Sometime in 1985, he and his wife split up. He said he met Tina Kimbrough in a bar and they were friends. In May 1986, he murdered Tina Kimbrough and was arrested for her murder. In December 1986, he pleaded guilty to the murder and he was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Wardrip was a model prisoner. He got his high school diploma and became a Christian. He ended up serving only 11 years before he was paroled in December 1997. After he was released, he moved to Olney, Texas. He got a job at a door and screen company. He became an active member of his church and even taught Sunday school. He eventually remarried. So Lil continued to investigate Wardrip. He found out that Wardrip lived in the same building as Blau's best friend. Also, Blau lived a block away from where Terry Sims was murdered. When Toni Gibbs was killed, Wardrip was a janitor at the same hospital where she worked. Also, Gibbs' car was abandoned in Wardrip's neighborhood. So Lil decided to trail Wardrip. He watched Wardrip, and one day, he saw him throw his coffee cup at work. Lil collected the cup and brought it to the crime lab. The DNA was compared to the DNA from Terry Sims and Toni Gibbs' crime scenes. It was a match. Also, Wardrip's fingerprints were compared to a blind fingerprint found on Gibbs' shoe. So in February 1999, he was arrested for the 3 murders. In custody, he confessed to all 3 murders. But he had more to tell the police. He confessed to a murder they had no idea he committed. In March 1985, Wardrip was in Fort Worth, Texas, looking for a job. On March 24th, 25-year-old Debra Taylor was at a bar in Fort Worth with her husband. Her husband left the bar early, and that's when she met Wardrip. When Taylor didn't come home, her husband reported her missing. Her body was found a week later. She had been strangled to death. Wardrip's memory from that night was hazy because he drank a lot and did a lot of drugs, but he said that he had killed her. Wardrip ended up pleading guilty to all 4 murders. For the murder of Terry Sims, Wardrip was sentenced to death. For the other 3 murders, he was sentenced to life in prison. In April 2010, the death sentence was suspended. But then, in September 2020, it was reinstated. Faryion Wardrip is currently sitting on death row at the L&B Polunsky Unit in West Livingston, Texas. No execution date has been set. Thank you so much for listening to the 50th episode of Into the Killing. Please don't forget to check out our brand new YouTube channel, Paranormally Listed. You can find it at youtube.com/paranormally listed. Of course, we still have our original true crime channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminally listed. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for listening.